afternoon, everybody. Very conscious that we're standing between lots of things, including the wedding next door. So I think we'll get underway immediately. To put this in some, I think this is the contextual session. This is the Jerry Maguire moment for maybe for the whole event, because it is about the price. Lionel Yo said yesterday that sport is all about providing compelling and captivating content, and then we just heard that compelling and captivating content seems to be going down in price because of the internet, and that in developed markets like Europe at least, rights pricing is flat. So I just wanted to understand from these guys, perhaps we could start with Josh, just in the Asian context, what are the value drivers in terms of what's driving the value of sports rights?
Well, I think you have to always look at the big picture. When you go into any sale, it's market by market, and you look at the overall factors. What is the market size? What's the economic power of that market? What is the competition level in that market? Then obviously when you look at both sides, whether it's the buyer or the seller, each has different motivation and different variables which they bring to the table. From the seller's point of view, it might be how much did they pay for the rights? What is their obligation to their federation in terms of balance between free-to-air, pay TV? On the flip side with the seller, what is their budget? How badly do they need the content? So there's so many variables that come into play. It's very hard to just say there's a cut-all formula for setting that price.
We promised earlier we weren't going to use the C word, the collusion word, but in the Asian context, in each of your experiences, this is to all of you, is there an Asian kind of approach to rights buying from the buy side? Maybe Nick, do you have a view on selling rights in Asia?
On selling? I've bought rights in Asia more than I've sold, but in terms of, collusion is an interesting word. Typically I think we prefer the word joint venture.
Nick, can you speak a bit more into the mic, Nick? We can't quite hear you.
How about that? I think collusion is often a dirty word. So people would rather go down the road of joint venture, and that typically, certainly in Asia, has been the way that rights fees in the past have been controlled to a lesser or greater extent with more or less success. Obviously with the breakup of the ESPN Star Sports joint venture, things are going to change again, but collusion, I don't think you tend to see too much of that, except in situations in markets where it's actually allowed.
I was more referring to just the challenge if you're the rights holder selling into a place where there is typically only one, possibly only two potential purchasers, at least in a broadcast sense. What kind of challenges does that represent in terms of your pricing model and the value drivers? Mark, you?
Sure. So I think, again, it's all market by market. You take a place like China where media is really controlled by the government, and you're trying to get on CCTV, and if you can't, they're the biggest game in town and the only game in town if you really want to have that instant hit across the whole market. But on the other hand, there's ways around that by maybe going to the regional broadcasters and kind of playing a network of that against the big national broadcaster. You can do that a little bit, but of course they all talk to each other and they all follow the leadership of the central government, which effectively is CCTV. CCTV5 in the case of sports, but the other thing that's emerged recently in China is the internet, and you have an interesting dynamic, a little bit what we just heard about happening in New Zealand with the rights there, and that discussion where the internet's actually leading the rights fees. In other words, you're going to get much better rights fees if you're NBA, for example, from Cena.com than you will from CCTV5. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that may start to emerge, particularly in these places where there is a monopoly on the TV side.
So what's the impact of that what is the impact of the internet on TV pricing? How does the TV broadcaster respond in the price negotiation to the threat of the internet in your scenery example?
Yeah, well, I think that's just an emerging dynamic, and we have yet to see the really final result of that. Again, I was going to say in other markets it still is very competitive. In Thailand, you have 3 or 4 platforms that are now, competing in the pay TV space. The same thing is starting to emerge in other markets, Indonesia, et cetera. So, again, it's very much market by market. I think when you first started talking about are people talking to each other, Korea is another example where I think there was maybe more. I want to put it in quotes because I want to be careful, quote unquote collusion than there is now. I think there's more competition emerging. Japan is another market where everybody talks to each other and there's no official collusion, but of course there's deep-seated relationships that you have to break into. So again, it's very much different by market in terms of how you see that happening.
And the assumption is that it's not, while the conversation's about price, increasingly now potentially the conversation's not just about a price, right? So, Kenny, do you see a complexity now with the pricing of content, with the negotiation of a rights deal, and the outcome is somewhat more complex from a price perspective than it would have been, say, 5 years ago, where there was really only one buyer, one right, which was the kind of live broadcast right?
Yeah, I mean, as someone in a group that's standing on the sort of buying side, as you like to describe it, and helping client brands, obviously understand the complexities of content rights, distribution in different markets. I mean, we don't really play a role in setting the price. Obviously, we're interested bystanders, if I might use that expression. That's purely a discussion, a transaction between the rights holder and media groups. What we're seeing, though, is clearly the cost of the rights is obviously subject to heavy inflation, and the risks involved in groups being able to sort of monetize and optimize and ultimately derive the returns that they want from those investments is becoming increasingly hard to justify. So, excuse me, there is a role that we can play as an agency and obviously as representative brands. Clearly the revenues that can come through advertising, media and sponsorship will play some influence in terms of how you determine the levels of bids that you put forward. And I guess the other sort of observation that I would make is it's quite unusual to some degree that someone representing brands would be sitting in this type of panel, because I think once upon a time the our voice, our perspective wasn't really necessarily sought at until the product, until the commercial deals have been secured. We now find, my presence here, and obviously it's borne out by the discussions that we have. We're approached quite early by broadcasters and obviously various media groups, as well as rights holders, often even prior to deals being agreed, where they're trying to obviously fundamentally get a sense of what are the potential revenues, what are the potential values that brands can bring, and through participating in collaborative models, fundamentally help some of these expensive rights acquisitions come to fruition.
So, the role of the sponsor is to arrive early and diffuse or manage risk, right? So, I think many of you are involved in sponsored content. How complex does it make it now, maybe Nick or Kenny or Josh, in terms of just how complex is it to have the sponsor involved in the price discussion?
I think it's interesting what Kenny's saying about his level of involvement, because if I look at valuations, and you look at some of the statistics that PwC gave us yesterday, revenues are increasing from sort of sponsorship and ad sales are increasing about 5% year on year. Rights fees are doing far, far more than that. And the monetization of rights is no longer coming from direct revenues from the ad sales and sponsorship revenues. In some markets, in some years, that revenue split might be 50-50 between the affiliate revenues, that money coming from the subscriber, and 50% coming from from advertisers or sponsors. I mean, that model no longer holds. I mean, in any number of large markets, the importance of the platform revenue is increasing exponentially. I've been doing some work in India, and once upon a time when I was at ESPN Star Sports, the sort of revenue split was, in some years, was depending on the cricket, was 60% ad sales and 40% affiliate. Now the projections being given out by a major broadcaster are that sponsorship and ad sales will represent about 1/6 of the pie, and all the revenue is going to come from their affiliates, their clients, the platforms that they work with, in some cases from digital media rights as well. So the sort of refinancing model that involves sponsorship, I'm interested to hear what Kenny says. I'd say it's been completely turned on its head.
Has it been turned on its head, or it's about to be turned on its head?
It is being turned on its head. I don't know if you can be on one head or the other, but I mean, it's somewhere in transition. It's fundamentally changing. I mean, when I was at ESS and we used to value rights, once upon a time we actually paid attention to what the ad sales guys had to say. And in the 7 years that I was there, I don't know if Chuck Less is in the room, but he and I used to scrabble about what is the value. And in the 7 years I was there, but by the end of it, the conversation with Chuck's group was interesting, but almost fundamentally irrelevant compared to the cost of those rights.
I'm sure he's delighted to hear that.
Sure.
Josh, does that dynamic then change? How is that changing the dynamic? Like if you're the rights holder now, are you in a different position? And maybe you could talk about this tiering concept that you've got in terms of your approach now.
Well, I think at the end of the day, content, what is it that you're selling is what's going to determine the price. And if you look at content in terms of low tier, mid tier, high tier, and premium high tier, and if you were to divide that and say things like the Olympic Games, the FIFA World Cup, the Asian Games here in this region, obviously those are at premium high tier. Premier League in most markets, obviously excluding, if we're talking about Philippines where the NBA fills that role, or India where cricket plays that role, and North Asia, and in Japan and Korea where they have their own sporting appetite. But, when you're talking about these fees going up and up year to year, it tends to be that the high tier rights, they're the ones where you're seeing double, triple, quadruple increases in value. The mid-tier segment is also become much more competitive because a lot of players are priced out of the high-tier market these days. But I think if you look at a trend overall, I would say that the rights on the bottom tier and the mid-tier are going to struggle long-term. And they're the ones that probably need the digital avenues even more so, because broadcasters are paying so much for the premium must-have rights that the other sports ultimately are going to be losing some revenue.
So to Nick's point then about the role of advertising and sponsorship, is that role slightly different depending on where you are in that scale, in the sense that if you are in a second or a third tier, maybe advertising and sponsorship will be maybe a higher proportion of the pricing model than if you were selling the Premier League? Yeah.
Sorry, I think what I understood of that is, are you saying is there a differentiation between how we look at Premier tiered events versus secondary events?
Yeah, the pricing. If we have a tiering system and if we have content which is, driver content and then secondary content, is the pricing model going to be different in the sense that is there a role for sponsored content, branded content in those kind of lower tiers, more so than if you were selling Premier League?
Yeah, I think, the brands ultimately are looking to, of course, engage and be part of that dialogue in that community, and clearly there are relevant communities in both Premier and secondary type sports. I think it all goes back to sort of kind of what's been said over the last 2 days in terms of what purpose brands have for having that sponsorship, and obviously they will look at appropriate sort of values and qualities that certain sports can give them and which they can trade off. But I think increasingly what is more important is what are the type of rights they would get around these sort of sponsorships that enable them to curate and build engaging content beyond, the broadcasts of live events.
Right. So, Mark, I think people generally perceive UFC's been very successful, or had some great successes in getting relatively new content introduced to Asia. Pricing strategies for you and the balance between price paid by broadcaster and sponsored content and branded content. How do you go about that on a market-by-market basis?
Sure. So, we're looking at this in a pretty long-term way. Certainly revenue in the short term is very important, but I think just as important for us is being with the right partner. And what does that mean? It's a lot of different factors. One is the market leadership. We're with great partners for longer term, like ABS-CBN and the Balls Channel in the Philippines, not only because they have very good reach and it's growing and they're building out their carriage, and we're also on a couple of the free-to-air platforms that ABS-CBN has from time to time, which is very important, but also the fact that they are into promoting the UFC on a longer-term basis. They're bringing fighter tours there. The same thing goes with Fox Sports for the rest of Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Same thing goes in Korea with CJ Media and Super Action. So it's more than just the rights fees. Of course, that's important, and we'll negotiate hard on those. And we've seen great growth there. But I think it's also all these other factors in helping us grow the sport and build the fan base. And the other important part of that as we go forward with the UFC is, and we've heard this theme come up time again throughout this week, this couple days, is really the localization factor, and we have to go local. And we have a plan next year to bring 5 or 6 events to Asia, and to localize programming. We're kicking off the Ultimate Fighter in China, which is a 12-episode reality show to create the next UFC star who is Chinese, that's going to be on national TV in China on Liaoning satellite there. That's a very typical example of how we're localizing, and with these events, it's localizing with a program maybe like the Road to the Octagon that we might do with some of the broadcasters in each given market to introduce the sport, to build local heroes, all that local interest. All of that's very important, and not only to build the viewership, but I think things like that are more attractive to the sponsor because we're able to do things more in the local market that are locally relevant. And so then you have the sponsorship support for the program that you might not have with just an advertising sale or try to get somebody to, put a few billboards on the show.
So you've got sponsored content, you've got a sponsor who is demanding for his or her brand to be exposed in the octagon, you've got a broadcaster who knows that. So what's that conversation like with that broadcaster?
Sure. No, I think it's a good one, because if we're open about it and we're saying, hey, let's work together, Simeon on some sponsorship pitches, for example, and get these guys in early. Let's create a platform where, the sponsor pays for the advertising, so the broadcaster wins there, but they're also featured in the octagon, and we're doing something collaboratively. So I think, again, getting in earlier on the process. Let's plan a show together. Let's plan a fight series together, if you will, for the next couple of years. I think can be a very attractive proposition both for the broadcaster and the marketing partner, if you will, or the sponsor.
Ian, maybe we can get a couple of questions in from the floor. Sure. We've got a couple of questions out there. A question over here. Let me come through with the microphone. It's probably quickest. Excuse me, can I just through?
Sure. Thanks, James. Laura Wendt from Singtel. I'd like to ask the panel about their thoughts on the impact of piracy on sports price. Seems to me that some rights holders and even content providers have their heads in the sand a bit on this issue. It's a significant impact when you're trying to gain subscribers and you're fighting a leaky box and free. So what are your thoughts on the impact of piracy on sports prices?
Josh or Nick, do you want to?
That's a good question. It's a very hard answer, though, to give you. We've been talking about piracy in Asia as long as I've been out here, which is over 16, 17 years now. And I don't know if there's an easy solution to it. I will say, though, that I think when you have top-level content and it's being delivered in the best possible way, people will pay for it. You know, people typically would rather not watch on their computer. No offense to Tim from our last panel. That will probably change in the future, but I think people still, live sport is still king, and they'd rather watch it on a big screen with their family. They want to be now these days watching with a second or third screen as well, to engage with their friends at the same time, to watch different camera angles and so forth on major events. So, when you're watching from the computer, at least for me personally, I don't feel it gives you the same experience. But I can't really answer your question in terms of what can we do about the piracy. I mean, obviously, the rights holders, we can try to take action against these people who are doing illegal streaming and other means, as the Premier League has been doing, taking the lead for a long time. But it's a very difficult problem to stop.
I think piracy takes, to answer your question, I don't think piracy has impacted license fees at all. They've continued to go up. People buying rights say, well, what about piracy? And rights holders say, okay, well, if you're not happy, the next guy's going to not worry about it. I think the piracy that's particularly damaging, though, is, and I think it sort of in part answers adds on to what Josh said, was piracy from streaming is one thing. It's the piracy from set-top boxes available in other markets, grey market boxes, that is really, really damaging, I think. And I was speaking to a guy who's bought Premier League rights here in Asia, and he's made a massive investment in the Premier League, and his investment is being completely eroded, not by people streaming it, but by the fact that there are illegal boxes coming into his market from another DTH operator in a neighbouring market, which is enabling the consumer to see it in high def, live, and and he's just paying a fraction of the price of what the legitimate rights holder is paying. And I think that's the kind of piracy that's damaging, and that's the kind of piracy actually that rights holders like the Premier League like to get involved with, because they can see where the target is. They can go after actually their own licensor, but their own licensee, but in a different market, and that's much more damaging, I think, than piracy streamed.
Thanks, Nick. Any other questions?
We've got a couple of questions out there. Over the back there, Mike Rich from GroupM. Yeah.
Hi. Just in terms of
just name an organisation.
As James said, Mike Rich from GroupM. I just wondered. I think it's quite interesting. When you look at contract renewals of players like sort of Gareth Bale and Cristiano Ronaldo the last couple of weeks in the range of 250 to sort of 500,000 euros a week. Do you think, with the sort of inflationary impact on the cost of broadcast rights of some of the major sports assets, that the dynamic of where those profits are going back into the ecosystem is delivering enough value back to the fan?
One of you guys want to have a run at that?
It's an interesting dynamic. I'm answering Mike's question, but could be a career-threatening answer. I think we've debated this internally, and I guess this is healthy debate for the panel. But whether we like it or not, the cost of rights will continue to increase, and obviously we see here in Singapore there's been sort of a certain amount of tension for the sort of perception of what the relative value of the rights versus the subscription fees. But I guess ultimately decent content and decent product prevails, and the market sort of corrects itself. And since the inception of sort of pay TV, we've sort of seen that upward curve. I guess to the question itself, no matter how the fan sort of engages with the sport through whatever device, through whatever channel, ultimately everyone will have their own sort of unique lifestyle and way of interacting with the live events, the magazine programs, the highlights, the backstories, and so on and so forth. I think from a brand perspective, obviously, we ultimately, if we are making investments into this particular space and we're associating with this whole experience, we ultimately want to make sure that the whole sort of process is managed and handled in a way that is positive, because what we've seen in, as I say, previous subscription rollouts, there's been significant amount of sort of tension around the whole sort of debate. And I think, as I say, it's irrespective, if it's something which comes through in a positive manner, and the market corrects itself, it's something I think brands will be encouraged to continue to participate in.
Is the market capable of correcting if that's a market malfunction, paying a player too much money? Is the market capable in our context in Asia of correcting that, or are we so far down that food chain that you kind of get what you're given?
I've seen the market correct itself. I've seen license fees go backwards. I mean, I've seen the Premier League's rights fees go backwards in certain markets. I mean, make no mistake, there's one thing that drives license fees, and that's competition. I mean, the quality of the content makes people more competitive for that content. If you look at Mark's content, there is competition for his content as well, and that's being driven by the fact that there are more platforms in the market, more channels in the market, and those channels need raw material, they need content, and that's what's driving his content costs. And so therefore, license fees will go back. And so I'm not sure that Gareth Bale's €100 million transfer makes much difference to those license fees, because frankly, that transfer has happened in a period where the Spanish league rights are already sold. So in a year's time or 2 years' time, when the league's back in the market, the Gareth Bale transfer will be old news.
So Mark, bandwidth constraints going down, more people want your content. Is that having a positive impact on pricing? Are you finding, demand's a good thing if you're a seller?
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to the dynamic that Josh was talking about earlier about the different tiers, you may have a top tier bidding war for, say, the English Premier rights, and everybody's bidding whatever the number is, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. The guy who doesn't get it, he's actually more hungry for content of, I wouldn't call us mid-tier, I'd say we're upper mid-tier at the moment. In some places it's a must-see TV, depending on the market and the audience. Particularly the 18 to 35-year-old male, potentially loves the UFC more than they do the EPL anyway, or other sports. So, we're actually seeing the fact that there's these bidding wars for these top tier can actually drive the price of sort of the next level even higher.
Great.
Please
James,
give yourself more credit, though. I think you should be in the high tier, Mark.
Well, appreciate it. How much do I owe you?
It's good to be aspirational content, Mark.
I think we've got a couple more questions out there at the back. Yeah, over there. Dino Lorena from ABS CBN.
Dino from ABS-CBN. Do you see the possibility that there will be more customization in pricing from market to market, considering that the hierarchy for, I imagine the hierarchy or two considerations. First is hierarchy for the desirability of the sport, and second would be the prevailing market conditions within the economy. Given that we all want to push and develop sports more into a sustainable future. So do you see those two things? Do you see those things happening? Like, we would see the prices differ from market to market, as opposed to, because I've been in a position wherein I've been told that, well, we can't give you it at this price only because I've already given it in another market for this particular price.
Josh, do you find variation by market?
Well, I mean, there's huge variation by market, but I think, to answer your question, as I said from the beginning, whenever you go into any sale, you need to have all the research behind you, understand what the market dynamic is, what level of competition there is. Mark's point was also very good. I mean, you can be coming in at the absolute right timing, even if you don't have the right content, if it's something that is, desired at that time, based on other factors such as if you have top-tier content, something else is gone, it's not available. But at least from my experience in distribution, we've never said, okay, we have X dollar fee in Thailand, and when I come visit you guys at ABS-CBN in Philippines, it has to be the same. It's I think any intelligent seller definitely knows each market's value and has done their homework before. If they haven't, I think it's very easy for you as a buyer to say, look, you're not in touch with what's happening here on the ground. Our fee structure is this, and then it's a new discussion.
James, I think we've got one more.
One more here.
Hass, Sport 5. This morning we talked about the growing role of sponsorship in events and the growing role of sponsorship to reach targeted audiences. For maybe niche or second-tier sports, as Tim pointed out, in certain markets, can sponsorship start to play a role in bringing down rights fees or taking the rights fee model from a mass broadcaster towards a subscription, pay-per-view, targeted model that Colosseum's doing? For some of these sports that aren't the Premier League, everybody but the Premier League. I mean, we can talk about maybe German football in markets where there's a large German community, or triathlon and Ironman, or is that a model that can happen as digital proliferation allows people to reach specific audiences?
So perhaps that's potentially two questions, right? The first one is, does sponsorship help actually deliver a content where necessarily the price may not be that high? And the second one was, maybe that's for you. And the second question is probably for you as well, Mark, which is, these multiple streams now that are available, does that unlock niches that previously weren't accessible, where the demand was there but there was no means of supply? I guess you want to be PPV everywhere if you could, right?
Well, I think on the first question, yes, definitely in certain cases, really for any sport, but particularly emerging ones or growing ones in a given market, the bringing a sponsor in can absolutely make the difference to maybe getting that show on the air or creating that show or not. Good example of that, I think, again, goes back to the Ultimate Fighter Chinese version that we're doing now for the China market, but also can be distributed regionally and globally, where if we didn't have a presenting sponsor in our pocket, we probably wouldn't have gone ahead with the show because it's a locally produced, newly produced show. That sponsor, by the way, is the Sands Corp, the Venetian and the Marina Bay Sands here are co-presenting. So that's an example where definitely sponsorship makes a huge difference to whether the show is on the air or not. In the other case, in terms of digital reaching niche, I mean, yes, in certain cases as well. We haven't found too many markets where that's our lead platform. Certainly China, it's been a very important distribution venue there, going back to the fact that internet is more readily available in many different places. There's less censorship of the internet, so on and so forth, so that's important there. Other places we're very much focused on getting the best TV exposure, and digital rights are secondary.
Do you other gentlemen have some exampes of
innovation?
I
was say it's a very good question that has asked, but the reality is, if you look at, it's always coming down to how good or how strong is that content. You can be the best salesman in the world, but if that content is not very strong, it will be very difficult to find sponsors. If you look at top tier programming like the Olympic Games, I think it's 47% of the IOC's revenue comes from TV, 45% from sponsorship. So at the high level, absolutely, you can bring in some huge dollars, and sponsorship can be nearly on par with the media rights. But then when you're talking about very smaller sports, it's very, very tough. But probably you're looking at 2-3% compared to 47%. So it really depends on what is the content, what's the proposition for how strong that is that you're bringing to the market.
Josh, you particularly at Dentsu, focused on the Olympics over the next few years, having picked up the rights for how many countries in Asia? Quite a lot.
17 countries across Asia, and then 5 in Central Asia.
So you've got some interesting negotiations coming up, presumably.
We have a lot of interesting negotiations coming up. I'm just one part of that team, though. I mean, it's actually being driven out of HQ, so I'll be involved in some of our negotiations in Southeast Asia. But we're in the process of launching the sales process now. And in fact, we're meeting some broadcasters in the coming weeks because it's a very short lead time. Sochi Olympics is the first of the two which Dentsu has acquired, and then the Summer Olympics in Brazil.
Kenny, you were going to comment on the sponsorship?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump on to Hass's question. I mean, I guess, you know, when we talk about sponsorship, and obviously how we've obviously referenced it over the last couple of days is sponsorship is a business tool to ultimately drive some sort of impact based on a brand's clear purpose. I look at sports rights as a similar business tool, but obviously for a broadcaster or for a media group, and you know, clearly the way that you may approach a secondary product, secondary sport, you know, should be to some extent slightly different to how you might approach a premier product, and given there's obviously more access, there's obviously greater flexibility with those sort of challenger type properties. I mean, there's an opportunity of creating formats and content which you wouldn't normally ordinarily see with those sort of top sports, and I think that's, you know, serves to obviously bring in new audiences, but also provides advertisers and brands with, you know, interesting vehicles which may align with their needs.
Final observations. If you had to point to a sport or an opportunity or a price that's underutilized out there at the moment in Asia, can you consider where those opportunities might be, one by one? Kenny, do you want to go first? Don't give away your business plans, just...
Well, I mean, we're sort of genre and platform agnostic, so I mean, depending on obviously the specific client and their needs, we will run the property through the rule and try and understand obviously what it can bring, both in reach and delivery, but also, you know, qualitative and intellectual property. So, you know, we've a lot of the work we've done isn't necessarily always with top sports. You know, we've worked with so-called sort of niche properties. The gentleman in the previous panel was here from Surfing Australia, and we've done some great stuff with them in Australia around, you know, with brands like Land Rover, and really using the sort of rights that wouldn't typically be available in a sort of you know, tier one sport to build some really powerful content and engage with, you know, strong communities in that market. And, you know, there's numerous examples of that in different markets. Mike spoke earlier about Indonesian football. We've done stuff in China around, again, sort of, you know, some of the martial arts and what have you. So it's it really depends on obviously, again, the sort of brand need and the purpose.
But Kenny, do you think there are, you know, top sports that you as an agency are more attracted to than others? You know, are there some sports that are more attractive to advertisers?
You know, and we're ultimately looking at you know, a number of different things. We're clearly sizes of audiences is still a key driver in our thinking, but I think, you know, increasingly it's obviously levels of engagement, and, you know, without that sort of, you know, deep connection, I mean, there's really not much a brand can do, you know, to harness the sort of power of that particular, you know.
So I can't pin you down on one particular sport then. Is it baseball, or is it Premier League, or is it niche sports like surfing? Is it anything particular, or is it just really everything specific to the advertiser?
Like I said, there's no specific focus. I mean, you know, always within our gaze, you know, the size of football and the prevalence of it through media distribution, and you know, obviously you look at markets like India, where, you know, cricket would be the equivalent, and in Australia, you know, obviously, you know, one of the big three codes. So I mean, there's no sort of specific focus.
Okay, just
I'd like to say the UFC is by far the most undervalued property in the market today. We're scheduled for about a tenfold rights increase the next 5 years. I'd like to say that, I'd like it to be true, but I think in reality, I mean, just to say that sports that are localizing, sports that have a great potential to, you know, to hit that growth curve and be able to do things locally. I mean, one of the advantages of the UFC is we are an individual sport with deep traditional base here in the Far East of martial arts. And, 135-pounder, or in the case of Korea, 145-pounder with the Korean Zombie can come out of Asia and compete for the championship, where not all sports have the luxury of that type of localization. So I think looking at it from a longer term, it's a very good place to bet.
Show me the money, Jerry. Josh or Nick, to finish up, 10 seconds.
Clearly local sport, and you look at the investments that broadcasters are making in those. You've heard CK talk about $30 million invested in Arena, his local sports channel. You look at what StarHub are doing here with Super Sports Arena and their relaunch, focus on local sport. And that sport will vary market by market. It could be football, or in Taiwan it could be local baseball. It depends. It's clearly local sport, and I'm not sure that it's local events featuring the UFC. I'm not sure that's where it is. I mean, I can see the attraction, but I'm not sure that that's what it is.
Okay, Josh, you get the last word.
I think it's just a very exciting time, because whatever kind of content you have, whether it's on any tier, it's a really it's an opportunity, because there's so many more platforms and so many ways you can distribute content these days. So it's just a matter of finding the best way to monetize that. So for all of us that are passionate about sports, it's a really exciting time, as the whole industry has changed now with second and third screen.
We're out of time. Please thank our panel.